Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder videos, and a tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video view series. Take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. This video will be reviewing the mini-adventure Crimson Snow, designed by Jonny Cordova for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. View copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy the content, consider using my affiliate links for your online shopping, supporting me via patreon.com/Rogue Watson. So Crimson Snow is a mini adventure that takes place in a snowy, isolated region. Hello, Icewind Dale. Hello, my current Rime of the Frostmaiden campaign, which many rightfully complained does not actually have the horror elements that Wizards of the Coast advertised that it would have. So goes to folks for picking up the slack. And I think when a lot of people picture, isolated, snow-covered areas, they picture horror because it's a great setting for that. Anywhere where your heroes are kind of stuck in a location, whether it's a spaceship or the rural country or where the environment itself is just kind of preventing you from being able to maneuver around, is a wonderful, fertile ground for a horror story. And the designer even mentions in the opening page that they were inspired specifically by 30 Days of Night and The Thing, which is probably one of the most classic, isolated, you're in the snowy region horror story. I think this one has some really cool ideas and some really fun uses of monsters, but it's ultimately too short. It's way too short. It's like I watched a 10-minute short on YouTube, and I was like, oh man, I wish this was a whole movie, or I watched a 20-minute episode and was like, oh man, I wish these were hour-long episodes or something. So that's it's partly complaint and partly praise, I guess, in a way, because it's like I liked it enough where I wanted more, but ultimately the complaint is I don't feel like there's enough here to justify it, honestly, which is probably I guess the biggest damning complaint. It wraps up too quickly and there's not enough content, and we'll get to that in a second, because it's like a 10-page adventure. It's very, very short. Despite that being very short, it's for levels 10, what does it say? Levels 10 through 13 is a solid tier 3, basically one-shot mini adventure, which is kind of shocking because you never see that. Like, everybody always focuses on that same level range, that sweet spot of like level 3 to 8, I think is where pretty much all D&D seems to like it's played these days. So huge praise for actually giving me something that's a little bit higher level. Unfortunately, because it's so relatively short, I don't feel like it properly justifies being a high level, because it's got these big, powerful boss fights, but the way D&D is balanced, I'm going to go off on a little bit of a rant here, is via the adventuring day. So if you just throw, like 2 combat encounters on your players per day, then they're going to be able to take out these really big boss threats without much problem. But if you have them at the end of a dungeon crawl, then suddenly you've worked out, okay, now your players have to work through their resources and their spell slots and their hit dice and all these things. It makes your short rest player characters come online because they're getting their stuff more often, versus having the long rest, characters feel overpowered because you're having so few things. So my main concern also is the fact that this, could be done in a single long rest, and there's not a whole lot. There's basically just the one big boss fight. So I feel, I haven't run this obviously, so I don't know the balance level. And yes, there are like multiple CR, 15s at the end, but it didn't feel like it had enough obstacles in the way, I guess, to justify this pretty high rank, which is disappointing, because I was like, oh man, level, tier 3, let's see what you got. And it really comes down to like throwing some big boss monsters to the players. So the story is there is a outpost out in some isolated snowy region that needs help, and the players are sent there. There's a few different adventure hooks. One of them is actually really cool in that they get these like nightmares, which kind of tease like ultimately what's going to happen, with some pretty obvious like metaphors of like bats eating people, which are supposed to be like the vampires and stuff. So but I think that the creepy dream stuff tends to go over pretty well in D&D and how to like set the stage. I love the Dramatis Personae, which helps explain our characters. We really only need them for probably 2 of the characters, but I still appreciate having 4 NPCs and really custom traits, ideals, bonds, and flaws. It's not like the designer came in and just randomly rolled on some tables. They actually took some time to detail out all these different characters. So a bunch of vampires came to this outpost, and so first a meteor crashed near this outpost. The meteor is almost a MacGuffin where it doesn't even really matter what's going on there, except for the very final act, I guess. But the main thing is a bunch of vampires moved into this outpost and have been feeding on, and they, disguising themselves as just workers, I guess, and have been feeding on the scouts there, but they use their spells and stuff to kind of make them forget that they're feeding on them every night. And it just, so the scouts are all like sickly and in bad shape, and they're plagued by nightmares, and they're just being fed on by these vampires. So, the whole vampire thing is cool. You show up and you're tracking like a werewolf out when you first reach there, and it turns out the vampires just have a werewolf that works for them, which Underworld would like a word with that, I think. I grew up where vampires and werewolves hated each other, damn it. That's how it works in my canonical universe. But they just have a werewolf that works for them. The head werewolf matriarch Elris is kind of in charge. She's got she's got this kind of dark family angle, which I appreciate. In vampire lore, does that very Interview with the Vampire, where I guess she's got a young son, which kind of flips the gender roles of that book/movie. She's got a young son who's like really feral and messed up, and then she's got I think it's actually referred to as a kind of a sibling who has gone down to the tunnels, checked out this meteor, and has now been plagued by nightmares. And nobody's quite sure what's going on there. So the players end up showing up. They just have like one scene with this vampire matriarch Elris and kind of talk to her. And there's, some insight checks you can make. And there's notes about how to handle this role-playing scene, which I appreciate. There's not really any good information if the players just decide, okay, she's full of shit, let's just attack her. And then what if she wants to go into vampire mode and do all that? There's nothing really there. So I guess they're meant to just kind of keep that in their pocket and eventually explore the nearby tunnel, because they're trying to search for the scout Zara, who was last seen going into the tunnel, and of course Elris doesn't really care about her at all. She's just using the werewolf to keep everybody in the camp. So the players go down to this tunnel, and you're thinking, okay, we actually got a little bit of a map. It's not a separate map, which is unfortunate, but it's a map of the outpost, which what's interesting there is you're not meant to fight on this map yet, but then in the final act, when you come back to the outpost, that's when things hit the fan and you end up having this big battle. So we do have this map, but it's, as far as I'm aware, just embedded in here. There's no big version of this map, so I don't know if I should count that as including a map. I guess it is a map, but it's not a separate image file that I can actually like drop into a VTT or something. And then we go into the tunnel, so I'm thinking, all right, here we go. Dungeon crawl, maybe the vampire's going to be behind us. We got to go, check out this meteor, and we're going to go through all this dungeon. There is no dungeon crawl, which is a shock, right? Because like every little mini adventure, like 90% that I've reviewed, unless they're like a Feywild thing typically, include some kind of a dungeon crawl. And that's, we just had a DM roundtable about how dungeons are like the name of the game. It's a major part of the whole D&D ecosystem, and the adventuring day and the balance level, and how the gameplay is just integral to the dungeon crawl, and to not do that here is just shockingly disappointing, especially because you're like, all right, a tier 3 like ice cave dungeon crawl, it's a skill challenge. It has been reduced to a skill challenge, which I will say a couple things about a skill challenge. First, I don't think they're all bad. I don't think they're all good. I think they're fine. I think a good skill challenge is used sparingly. It is obfuscated, so the players maybe aren't even aware that they're doing it. But it can be kind of tricky, because once you start like, oh yeah, you guys tell me what skills you want to do, then they're like, okay, we're in a skill challenge. So it gets kind of weird like that versus just going through a dungeon crawl. Now, as far as skill challenges go, I think this one is actually fairly well designed, and I like the way that the way you design a skill challenge is not to do a permanent fail state, but instead like a fail forward. So it becomes like a penalty system, whereas if you keep succeeding and you get enough successes, then nothing bad happens and you reach your goal. Versus, so success is not rewarding you, it's just preventing you from getting failures. Because each failure you get is going to end up giving you like equivalent of like a trap exploding on you. Or in one case, it says the adventurers are ambushed by a pack of wolves. Okay, you can add a random encounter, but you can't just say the sentence, the adventurers are ambushed by a pack of wolves. You're not writing a novel. This is a design document you're giving to a DM to run the game. What does that mean? 1d6 wolves, 2d6 wolves? Is there a stealth? What's the perception check to search for these? Like you got to give me more information there. You can't just say that sentence flippantly. Like you're designing this thing, and that's an encounter you're designing. One of them involves you like track it to a Remoraz. Like, okay, does that mean we're actually fighting this creature? Does that mean we just see it up ahead? Like there needs to be more information there. So there's a little bit, whereas the traps actually have pretty good information. There's a nice little slide, slide down 50 feet, drop, and if you fail your save, you take all this damage. That works fine. So I think the skill challenge, how it is designed, is fine, with the caveat that I think it messed up on some of the combat encounters. But I would have preferred if this was like a slice of the dungeon crawl, right? Like if we actually got the dungeon crawl, we're going through these tunnels, and then you reach like a section of the cave tunnel that like branches off into all these different directions. And then you could have it be, okay, here in, T7, whatever the tunnel section is, instead of tracking players like movement and things, we just enter the skill challenge. This room, what is this area, is a skill challenge. And so to navigate through these tunnels, you have to make all these different successes based on all these skill checks and things. That is how I would want to see this included, not as a replacement for an entire dungeon crawl. Even if it's a small dungeon, it could be like 6 rooms or something. That's fine. Again, I'm using the term room very generically, but you can't just have this be the whole thing. I would have preferred if this were like a section of the dungeon itself. So I'm going off on this because that was a huge disappointment for me as somebody who likes the dungeon crawl. I was looking forward to what a tier 3 dungeon would look like, an ice cave, with this creepy meteor at the end and what kind of things it's doing, and just is not there. So that really sucked. When you get to the meteor, it's not even you basically just make if somebody walks up to it I think if you see it, you have to make a wisdom save, and then you walk up and touch it, and you just get a nightmare that kind of vaguely tells you about what more is going to happen in terms of this big climactic battle you're about to have. But that's it. There's no other real thing going on there. And then you find the one NPC who can kind of give you the info dump, tell you the truth about, oh, hey, by the way, those people you talk to are actually vampires, and I've seen them do their thing. I've been hiding out in these caves because I don't want to go back to town or go back to the outpost because they'll, catch me and either eat me or Men in Black magic thingy me. And I've been trying to find like another path out of this area. And you can, enlist her as a helpful NPC, or just say, okay, stay here and we'll go deal with that. And then Act 3 is you return to the outpost. Happens to be night, of course. And when you come out, there is no, it's scripted. So there is no you confronting the vampires. You just walk outside and happen to see the vampires are just starting to attack everybody. So there's not even really a big mystery like, oh, we found out. Now we have to be careful about going through and tie. None of that. And that's disappointing too. And I realize that's hard to design. I think I've said this before, but vampires can be very, very fun to design because they are manipulative and sneaky and charismatic and all these things that make a villain really interesting ultimately. But if you just reduce them to monsters, that obviously is very disappointing. Now, in the beginning, they weren't that, right? We got to talk to Elris and hear her side of things, and you could do the inside check. So I was on board with that in the beginning. But then when we get to this final act, it's just there is no good confrontation or anything. It's the mother and the little son. They're just reaching out. It's just nighttime, and she's like, "All right, go feed," and he goes and starts eating people. And the brother starts he sticks his werewolf on people, and then he starts attacking. So it becomes this big fight. And it's she is a vampire warrior, which is like a CR 15, which all these stat blocks are included, which is nice. These are from I believe Monster Manual / the Starspawn Larva Mage is from More Than Kindness, Tomb of Foes. And at some point when the brother either dies or just after a few rounds, he will transform into a Starspawn Larva Mage. He goes from a vampire spawn into a Starspawn Larva Mage because of what he experienced with the meteor. Now, it doesn't mention anything about what the players touch the meteor, what happens to them. It's just, you just saw that nightmare. But he's been plagued by this for days, and he transforms into a Starspawn Larva Mage, which means he suddenly becomes another CR 15 boss the players have to deal with. So there's some interesting little RP notes where the vampire matriarch sister lady will still oh, he's okay, he's still, and kind of go a little bit grief crazy, I guess, in terms of not wanting to harm him. And so it's, in other words, an interesting thing where the villains are still allied against you, even though he has become his own villain faction where he won't give a shit about anybody else. Now, as a vampire, she can be reduced to 0 hit points and just flee, and it doesn't mention anything about her. It says her true resting place isn't at the outpost. Nothing. She just gets to escape, and there's no follow through there. So really, the fight's not over until this new Starspawn Larva Mage is destroyed, and then that's just the end of the adventure. So it's a cool final boss battle for sure, because we've got multiple big scary monsters. We've got suddenly vampire. I guess it's just the one werewolf. But you know, that's really neat. And then the fact that one of them transforms into a big boss is kind of cool. It just feels like it all happened way too quickly. Really everything just happened too quickly, honestly. Like at the beginning, I would have liked if it had taken maybe place over a couple days of like scripted events happening and the player slowly learn. You know, you got to draw out the mystery. Like look at all the act ones of all the horror stories. That shit is a build up to, you know, the atmosphere and the story and what's going on. And a lot of them are very mystery, which is what makes them so cool. It's like what's going, you know, if it's a slasher, it's like who's killing us, and if it's a, you know, ghost story, it's like what's the, you know, what's all the haunts happening, what's the reason behind it, and you know, why are all these scouts getting, so why are they sickly, and maybe we can do some investigation checks on that, and you know, really tease that out and let it be a little bit longer. And then I would have liked the proper dungeon crawl for the actual ice tunnels to the meteor thing. I think the meteor should have been, the players are going to want to like inspect the shit out of that or deal with that in some way, and it ends up being kind of a nothing. And then when you actually come back, I would have liked another like really interesting, like, okay, now you know the information, how do you deal with this, how can you best, you know, work out from the player point of view. And have that in, you know, have the DM's back pocket being like, okay, I can trigger this big vampire feeding if I want to, but maybe we'll see what the players do and how they want to deal with having this information. And then you can do all the, you know, final act 3 stuff. So there are the bits and pieces of a framework of a good adventure here, but there's not nearly enough to make it interesting, I guess. I was just really disappointed in everything except that opening act, I guess, which, you know, started thinking like it was going to set the stage, but it just didn't end up fulfilling that initial promise. And ultimately, the conclusion just wraps up too quickly, and the actual epilogue is just, oh, by the way, if you want to like collapse the tunnels to bury this meteor, then you can do that, even though maybe Frank over here touched the meteor, so he might go crazy and turn into a Star Spawn mage. I don't know the rules about that. The designer doesn't seem to know about the rules about that, so it's all a little bit nebulous there. All right, let's go over my pros and cons for Crimson Snow. Pros: detailed dramatis personae for our primary NPCs, including all these custom traits, bonds, flaws, ideals. I really think that was a great touch, even though we don't end up really using Mordid or Senstein as like NPCs we can speak to, but Zara and Elris being the vampire matriarch, and Zara being that scout in the tunnels, we do use them quite a bit. So I just like it that this is only a 10-page document, but a whole page was dedicated to like fleshing out for these NPCs, which is pretty nice. Pro: climactic battle features werewolves, vampires, and eldritch aliens. I don't actually know what a Star Spawn is supposed to be, but I'm going with eldritch alien. That is cool. Like the rule of cool for like horror is just you're just throwing a bunch of crazy shit in there. I like the fact that you've already, you know, you could have already just done the vampire thing and would have been satisfyingly creepy and cool. And then on top of that, you transform one of your vampires into this like otherworldly maggoty alien mess thing is really cool on top of it. So I appreciate that. Ended up hitting the right notes in terms of a climactic battle, but as we get to the con, it speeds through things way too fast. The story is almost over as soon as it starts, and it just wraps up too neatly in the end with just defeating the vampires, but one of them still gets to escape because she's a vampire that has that ability. And the Star Spawn thing, like we never really get any kind of clues about that or closure on that or anything else, and I thought the epilogue area was kind of lacking. Another con is the dungeon crawl is just non-existent. There is no dungeon crawl. It's reduced to a skill challenge. Yes, I kind of like the way the skill challenge is designed, but it's still ultimately a con because I don't like the fact that it replaced my dungeon crawl. As I mentioned in the review, keep the skill challenge, but make that a section of the dungeon, but give me a proper dungeon crawl. It's very rare that I want to even see an adventure without a dungeon crawl. It can happen. I have seen those that have been designed that way that can work, but it's pretty specific. When in doubt, use the dungeon crawl, please. And that's kind of included in the con is no map, but we don't have a dungeon crawl anyway, so there is no map for that. So final verdict: Crimson Snow begins as an intriguing, isolated horror story, but ultimately fails to expand beyond a big monster brawl. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can watch more reviews and follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel and support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson. Shouts to Platinum patrons: Joe, Will, Tiny Dancer, Thomas, Adam, Stan, William, I'm Loud, Al, Kyle, Brandon, Genocider, David, Jammin, Clam, Seth, Nebula99, and Eclectic. Gold patrons: RPG, Papercrafts, Pretty Boy, and Yuma, Marcus, Dead Lizard, Lion, Sam, Lumpy Spuds, Jerome, Nathan, Fassica, Tortoise, James, and Lasser. Thank you all very much for your support.